everybody. On behalf of Centrify, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Debunked, 5 Myths About PAM for Modern Enterprises. Before we go into the session, just a few housekeeping items. There will be a few poll questions throughout the presentation, so you'll have an opportunity to weigh in with your experiences to help us all better understand what you're facing in the real world. If you have any questions, please submit them via chat box. We do have a lot of ground to cover today, but we will try our best to save some time at the end for Q&A. So Tony, let's make sure and do that. Failing that, we'll get back to you individually if your question's not addressed in today's session. Also, the slides and the recording will be emailed in the next 24 hours. And then finally, on your left, you'll see the link to our other upcoming webinars and events. We also do have a free trial, so after the webinar you're interested in trying us, that link is available there. And then to promote the webinar, our design team put a really fun video together, so I thought I'd include that as well. You guys can watch it after. It's just about 30 seconds or so. So with that, let's get started. In 2018, Zero Trust security gained a lot of popularity as more organizations recognized Zero Trust as the only approach to security that works. That's the good news. The bad news is that when it comes to managing workloads spread across the now hybrid enterprise, many are still concerned about security, especially whether privileged access management is viable. There are several misconceptions surrounding PAM that leave the new attack surfaces in the cloud exposed and that impede end-to-end coverage. Given the realities of today's hybrid threat landscape, a modern approach to PAM via Zero Trust privilege is the antidote to becoming statistic. And as we move through 2019 into next year, there's never been a better time to rethink the outdated PAM security approach and move towards Zero Trust privilege. My colleague, Tony Golding, will review with you the 5 myths about PAM for modern enterprise and illustrate best practices on how to execute this security strategy in organizations independent of size, industry. The 5 that we picked are the top myths. There are many others. Tony might touch on those too, but the 5 we picked are great. And Tony, welcome. Tony is a cybersecurity and product evangelist here at Centrify. Internally, he contributes to product strategy, education, and externally, he has provided commentary and byline articles for media outlets covering topics such as cybersecurity, data breaches, identity and access management, Zero Trust privilege, risk management strategies. The list is very long, but I will stop and welcome Tony to the webinar.
Thanks, Natasha. Hello, everybody. It's very nice to be with you, and going to spend the next hour, I guess, with you to talk about a very important topic. So let me just go to the next slide. I think there may be a slight delay between what I'm pushing and what you're seeing, but hopefully everything will catch up appropriately. But in terms of the agenda, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about these 5 myths, the top 5 myths, as Natasha mentioned. But before we dive into that, we're going to spend 4 or 5 short slides just to remind ourselves why PAM is a critical, if not the most critical, security control that we should be prioritizing as and when we migrate our workloads to the cloud. All right, so this slide is kind of provocative. It says that today's security is not secure. So I guess, frankly, this is supported by a lot of different statistics, including some of the ones that you'll see on this slide. So one of them is that last year, Gartner said that about $117 billion was spent on security, and that this year that number is predicted to be a whopping $137 billion. So that's a lot of cash. But when they also tell us that 2/3 of companies are breached irrespective of that spend, and worse still, they're breached 5 or more times, then, clearly there's something wrong. So a big question for you folks in the audience might be, given that the domain of security is such a broad place and you have kind of limited budget, where would you spend your security budget in order to put the biggest dent in that particular picture? So on with a few more slides. Analysts are consistently telling us that between 70 and 80% of breaches involve the misuse of privileged credentials, so the stuff that our IT administrators use day in and day out, like administrator and root and Oracle and SA and all those good things. Now, our own research backs this up. We did an analysis with Forrester, and that score came to around about 75%. Now, the research that we did with Forrester, it also highlighted some other important things, and that is that a lot of organizations have no kind of basic essential security controls in place. And their account hygiene, especially their privileged account hygiene, is very poor. And so 65% are still sharing root and local administrator for, just the day-to-day routine administrative activities. In terms of MFA, today MFA technology is way more advanced and easier to deploy and manage than it ever was before. And it can be a really, really good first step to help avoid breaches. But even with that, 65% of companies don't enforce MFA for their privileged administrators and their access to the critical assets. So I think, frankly, that's a pretty shocking result. Now, our final stat on this, the market is starting to understand that privilege abuse is the #1 attack vector. So back in 2018, not too long ago, Gartner, they listed PAM as one of the top 10 InfoSec projects, and again for 2019. They also predict that PAM is going to be the #2 fastest growing InfoSec segment, right behind CASB's. Now, PAM's been around for years, but the risks created by the cloud and mobility and hybrid infrastructures, these new attack surfaces are causing a resurgence in PAM, which is kind of why we're on this webinar today, to learn a little bit more about PAM and especially the myths. So let's get into those myths. Let's talk about myth #1. Now, of the 5 myths I'm going to talk about, this one is probably the most chunky in terms of content, but I would argue it's probably the most important. It deals with the fact that many IT and security shops, they believe that in order to protect themselves against these credential-based breaches, all they need is a password vault. They fundamentally believe in a simple equation, which is PAM equals vault. Well, in reality, there's a lot more to PAM than just a vault. And if we ignore that, we can be exposed to a lot more risk. And so let's explore this myth and find out why a PAM is not simply just a vault. So fundamentally, PAM exists to control and manage the use of shared privileged accounts. I think we all understand that. The accounts that, if they were compromised, could result in really big problems depending on the motivation of the attacker. But the privileged access aspect of PAM is all about these privileged users and their use of privileged accounts to give them the rights and the permissions they need to do their job. All right? The management aspect of PAM helps us answer the following security-related questions. So which users should be considered privileged? Now, in this context, it's not me, it's not Natasha, it's not my other colleagues in product marketing. It's the folks hired to manage the infrastructure, mainly in IT, the sysadmins, the database admins, the web admins, maybe the ops team, developers, QA, who need some degree of privileged access to do their jobs as well. But PAM needs to manage the accounts that these users will use to log into these critical systems that we see in the diagram on the right. Now, obviously, we know that some accounts will have more or less privilege than others, but we don't want a database admin playing around with the web servers. And we don't want the web server admins playing around with PCI servers that contain credit card information. In other words, it shouldn't be black and white. It shouldn't be all or nothing. And that kind of gives us an early hint that perhaps administrators and their routine access to the super user accounts like root and administrator and Oracle and Cisco, it's not such a great idea because it gives them and cyber adversaries, if they compromise those accounts, way more rights than their job function needs, exposing us to a lot more risk. So with that foundation, let's get to the meat of this first myth. Why isn't a vault sufficient to do what PAM really promises for us? 2 things. First, vaults definitely add value. Let's be clear about that. Vaults are very, very useful. They help reduce risk by taking shared account passwords pretty much away from admins out of their heads, right? So they've got these admins in their brain. They remember what the passwords are, but it takes them away from them. It takes them off spreadsheets, Excel spreadsheets, and sticky notes. And it also prevents the open sharing between IT colleagues or even non-IT colleagues. So there's often, fairly blatant sharing of those credentials within IT or even outside of it. So instead, what we do is we store them in a vault where we can better control their use. But what they don't do is they don't reduce the attack surface. So the number of shared privileged accounts and passwords pretty much remains the same. They simply relocate from one place to another, to the vault. Now, a big part of our goal as security practitioners is to reduce this attack surface by significantly reducing the number of privileged accounts, because each one of those accounts represents an attack vector. So in that respect, vaulting doesn't materially reduce risk, but it clearly does have value. Now, the second thing to note, a vault's impact pretty much stops at login to computer systems. In other words, if you check out the administrator password to an account and you use that to log in, then you pretty much have the keys to the kingdom. Getting a bit aggressive on the clicks here. You pretty much have the keys to the kingdom. And so, you can do anything. You can access anything on that system. You can take it out of commission, but also an attacker can do the same thing. So if they compromise that credential, they can pretty much have the same access that you would have in using that account. So even though the vault is a valuable tool, it kind of perpetuates the routine use of these super user accounts. It doesn't really help us constrain what that user can do on the target system. But PAM in general does accommodate this. So PAM as a discipline does accommodate that scenario. It's just that the vault, as part of PAM, doesn't. You can squeeze a lot more security out of PAM, and you can mitigate a lot more risk. So what else is there in terms of PAM? So I like to look at PAM as a two-sided coin. On one side is password vaulting, which is what we just discussed. On the other side is privilege elevation. And privilege elevation is tied to the concept of least privilege. Now, privilege elevation encourages something called identity consolidation. So that means deleting as many local privileged accounts as possible. So by doing that, you're really actively shrinking that attack surface. And of course, there are some accounts that can't be deleted. And so for those that can't be deleted or disabled, you vault them. So privilege elevation allows us to use the vault for its intended original purpose, which is to vault away all of those remaining shared privileged accounts and ideally never use them except in emergency kind of break glass or fire call situations. So instead of our administrator here on the screen, Roger, checking out the root account on a daily basis routinely, he will instead log in with his own individual account. And that will typically be an AD account that can be used to log into any Windows, Linux, or Unix system, and that kind of avoids the management overhead of different accounts on every system, but I digress. His own account, Roger, has basic rights. Now, those basic rights can also be managed from AD, which means that we avoid using things like sudo and sudo as files and having to manage and synchronize all of those. But the point is that with these basic rights that Roger has, sure, he can read email, he can surf the web, but implicitly he has not been granted administrative rights. So even though he is, as his job function, an administrator, he doesn't have administrative rights. And this is a founding principle of zero trust. Now, when Roger does actually need to perform some kind of administrative task, then PAM software or privilege elevation software on those target systems will allow him to temporarily elevate his privileges to perform that task, but only the tasks that are relevant to his job function. So if he's responsible for managing users, then he can run user management tools and apps, but he can't do other admin tasks like database administration or software installation. And so by doing this, privilege elevation actually goes further than the vault because it also constrains what the administrator can do on the system itself. So we're not just talking about login access, we're also now managing authorization, what the user can do on that server itself. So here on the slide then are 4 big rock benefits that privilege elevation has. But there are additional benefits that will also come along with privilege elevation. So root, administrator, Oracle, Cisco, we know these accounts. They're all shared privilege accounts. They're anonymous by nature. They're shared with multiple people. And so trying to tie privileged activities back to the human user is very, very difficult. With least privilege, Roger logs in as Roger. And so all audited activities tie back to him. You get this 100% accountability that you don't get with the typical shared account password mechanism. Also backdoor coverage, so vaults can be bypassed. So a common thing is to, for example, check out the root password. If I'm an administrator, I might go to the vault legitimately, check out the root password, use it to log in, let's say to a Linux box, but then create a backdoor SSH key. So then the administrator or even the attacker can bypass the vault completely using that SSH key to log in directly to the server. It's kind of what they did routinely before anyway. They don't like the idea of something new called a vault coming into play. So check out the password, log into Linux, create a backdoor SSH key, and log in directly to the machine via SSH. So with privilege elevation performing access control on the box itself, it can block that kind of activity. And in fact, since we're now using a least privilege model, the Roger account on the screen, it won't give any attacker heightened privileges. So if they happen to compromise that account, they've just got the basic privileges that that account gives them. So they wouldn't necessarily be able to, for example, install that backdoor SSH key in the first place. There's also visibility. So this ties to the previous bullet in that bypassing the vault also bypasses auditing and session recording, because if all you have is a vault, then all of that is typically performed at the vault itself. Now with privilege elevation and session recording both on the host, you get this full visibility into all of the privileged activities. So even if the vault is circumvented, you'll still get that at the host level. And that's critical for compliance and incident response, investigations, etc. And I guess finally, since Roger's local accounts on the various systems on dozens or hundreds of Unix boxes or Windows machines, since they can be deleted in favor of using a single AD account, then IT no longer has to manage sudo as rights. They don't have to manage local accounts, and so you get a big productivity benefit by doing that. And you also get centralized control of that user's roles and rights, because we can now centralize those in AD, and we have this kind of cross-platform ability to manage roles and rights. It's not just Windows-centric. We can use AD to manage roles and rights cross-platform, which is a big benefit. So in summary, yes, it is a myth that PAM equals a vault. PAM equals a vault plus privilege elevation. They complement each other, and together they help you reduce the attack surface to the max. Now, when we get to myth number 5 about ransomware, you'll hear some additional evidence as to why it's so important to ensure that whatever PAM solution you deploy, it includes a comprehensive privilege elevation component in addition to the vault.
Yep, and on that, Tony, we actually just did a ransomware webinar last month, so great. You'll talk about that. Fantastic.
All right, so I believe now we actually have a poll question. So prior to this webinar, what was your understanding of PAM? What did you think PAM consisted of? So if you select the option that best represents that, please go ahead and check it. We'll spend about 10 minutes until the results come in. 10 seconds, I beg your pardon. And we'll come back in about 10 seconds. All right, so I think some are coming in now. We are seeing a little bit of delay between the screens being painted at your end and what we're getting at this end. So I'll see if we've got any results that have come in. Oh, we do. So PAM is simply a password vault, right? So I think we've got the most. I was aware of both sides of the PAM coin and recognized how they individually can. That's awesome. So that is pretty cool. So part of this education of myth number one, I guess 35% of the audience, it fell on deaf ears because you're already aware of that, which is awesome. But quite a few of you didn't realize that, and at least one of you said, what is PAM again? It's kind of cool. Maybe we'll reach out individually to those people and go through another webinar. But that is interesting stats. So thank you for helping contribute to our understanding of our audience. Let's move on to myth number two. So myth number one was a bit of a marathon. So this one will be a little less crazy. In myth number two, we try to answer a very common burning question, and that revolves around concerns that PAM has not really evolved at the pace of the cloud, and so it can't really be used to support cloud migration projects. Now, I don't want to scare anyone or be overly kind of dramatic, but the vast majority of PAM solutions are not suitable for cloud migration projects. So they're kind of stuck in the Stone Age. They're meant to serve more of an on-premises data center kind of centric world where all of our users, all of our systems are essentially under the same roof. Now, we'll dig into the whys in the next myth, but for now, there is light at the end of the tunnel, so I don't want to leave you hanging. So, for example, centralized zero trust privilege is in lockstep with these advances, and it's sort of out of necessity and listening to our customers and observing the industry and how things are moving, we've had to develop a PAM Vault from the ground up. It's as a cloud-native service and something that can accommodate hybrid cloud scenarios. And we began that journey back in 2015 when we delivered the industry's kind of first PAM as a service offering. And we've been evolving it ever since then to address new use cases. Kind of use cases that may be foreign to more of an on-premises centric world. So with that, let's move on. So why are things different? So what caused us to go back to the drawing board and make some major investments in a new vault? So this picture helps us understand how the dynamics have changed between what we have seen as a traditional on-premises world and the cloud from a PAM perspective. So historically, what we've done is we focused on human administrators, largely human administrators, kind of interactively logging into servers and into network devices and using privileged accounts that we shared amongst our team. And we typically used passwords for access, even for highly privileged accounts. Now, our access controls in the form of policies and rules, they were typically static. And so it was kind of left up to IT security or IT to manually maintain these things and to adjust them with, kind of a constantly changing security landscape and attack methodologies. And that very often didn't get done. Static rules and policies are often kind of left to gather cobwebs. But within the cloud, we have a different set of dynamics. And so the cloud also represents a major set of new attack surfaces. Now, we still need to accommodate human admins. Let's be clear about that. So interactive administrative logins are still part of our scene. We still need to accommodate that. But now we see the pendulum swing dramatically towards authenticating applications and services to other apps and services. And so these more headless activities can radically outnumber the interactive human logins by orders of magnitude. For example, Hadoop. So a lot of our customers have Hadoop projects, and they can involve dozens of clusters, each with hundreds of nodes, all communicating with other nodes and all requiring the use of credentials. If we look at containers, applications designed and developed for the cloud, they're no longer these arcane, single, monolithic pieces of code that we used to develop running on a single server, which is typical of the on-premises world. They can now consist of dozens or hundreds of independent microservices running in containers, and each one requires a credential or multiple credentials to communicate. So in this scenario, we need to provide DevOps, for example, with the ability to avoid embedding credentials and sensitive configuration information directly in their code and their config files, because they're a prime target for cyber attackers. They'll be trawling the disk looking for this type of intelligence. Instead, we want to give them the means to obtain this programmatically in real time so that it's not discoverable statically within the code. So instead of an old school reliance on static vaulted passwords, we need to give these constituents, the DevOps people specifically, the ability to request short-lived tokens because they're stronger than static passwords and they only live for the duration of the session. Now, going further, because all of this kind of dynamic change, human admins, they're trying to maintain static rules and policies, and they're fighting against the tide. So in kind of the new regime, if you will, we would fare better with something that's more dynamic, something that's contextual, and something that's risk-aware, one that can, for example, profile a user's behavior over time and react to changes that might indicate a breach. So these are some of the dynamic change that we've seen from the legacy world to the cloud or the hybrid world. Now, Centrify's response to this was to develop a vault as a SaaS service. So it's cloud native. It can accommodate multiple different types of scenarios. It could actually work very well with a pure on-premises world. It could satisfy a pure cloud infrastructure or the most common scenario, which is a hybrid of the two. So, for example, our users may have accounts in Active Directory or LDAP on premises, but they need those accounts to log into Windows and Linux boxes and containers in the cloud. Now, with a multi-tenant vault kind of designed for the cloud, it's accessible from anywhere, and it doesn't require physical replication of the vault into each VPC and cloud provider. So your users, whether they're internal or maybe third-party kind of outsourced IT, they can simply log into it from their browser. And in this architecture, we've also introduced a new concept that perhaps legacy architectures didn't need, and so they didn't accommodate. We've built what we call a lightweight gateway server. And this lightweight gateway server that you see circled on the screen, these things are they're not vault replicants. In other words, they provide the SaaS vault with the services that it needs to interact with whatever's on premises or in the VPC, such as having access to Active Directory or LDAP for user authentication, such as providing the downstream RDP or SSH protocols and sessions so that we can support remote login. A web server so that we can do VPN-less secure remote access, something that I'll touch on a little later, and other things such as a Radius client and server for MFA so that we can support, let's say, our incumbent RSA Secure ID, for example, for MFA. Now, applications and services that need to programmatically check out passwords or obtain short-lived secure tokens, they can do that really easily in this model. They can use CLIs or they can use REST-based API calls to the vault, and again, they can do that from anywhere. Now, this model also seamlessly integrates with that other side of the PAM coin. So here we just see the vault, but the other side of the PAM coin I mentioned earlier, the privilege elevation that's running on each server, this thing works seamlessly with that to support identity consolidation and least privileged access. So you may log into the vault to get a remote session to that server, but once you're logged into the server, the privilege elevation kicks in to govern what you're allowed to do on the box itself. So for this myth, your cloud migration projects are definitely not excluded. Modern PAM solutions exist specifically to handle these kind of hybrid cloud infrastructures and their use cases, some of which are very unique to these models and that didn't really manifest themselves with kind of the pure on-premises world of the past. All right, so I wish I had a bottle of water, but that's okay, I'll carry on. So moving on then, let's go to myth number 3. So This one sort of carries on where the previous one left off. So in the previous one, we highlighted the differences between the traditional on-prem world and the new hybrid cloud world. And we confirmed that new PAM solutions definitely exist to support it. But this one gets under the covers a little as to why an existing vault just doesn't cut the mustard. And many customers have already invested a ton of time. Lots of money, lots of ongoing support for their existing on-prem legacy vault. They would really like to hear that it can be easily and quickly extended to support these kind of hybrid cloud use cases. Unfortunately, my short answer is no, but we'll take a look at why that is. Your mileage may vary, but generally speaking, it's not going to be as adaptable. So going back to the diagram that we saw a few slides prior, pretty much all the commercial PAM vaults were designed for that left-hand side, on-premises use cases and their dynamics. But we'll give credit where credit's due. They certainly did their job admirably. But within the cloud, though, the world is way more distributed, and it's all about elasticity and massive scale. So authentications, for example, they're not a few dozen or a few hundred a minute as we might get with pure human administrative interactions. They're thousands, with apps and microservices in containers doing most of that communication. So the use cases have clearly changed. Now, so have the authentication requirements. So modern PAM solutions, they need to wear multiple hats. They're not just a glorified database storing static passwords. For example, they need to act as a true authentication provider. So they need to go beyond just serving up static passwords to admins. They now need to serve up things like SAML tokens and OAuth and SSH certificates and Kerberos tickets and PKI certs, et cetera, So those need to be served up to the applications and services running in your workloads to help them adhere to the kinds of policies and mandates that we hear more and more now that are demanding stronger forms of authentication, coming from outfits like NIST and PCI and GDPR. So as you start to migrate to the cloud, you may begin with a very simple footprint. It may be like a single project that results in a single virtual private cloud. In this example on the screen in Google Cloud. But as time goes on, you'll likely establish additional projects and proofs of concept, maybe in the same cloud or perhaps in different clouds. Let me just check the time here. How are we doing? Good. Maybe in different clouds so that you can sort of avoid putting all your eggs in one basket. Now, some projects may grow and scale even further than that. So over time, it's somewhat of an inevitability that you will end up with multiple virtual clouds across multiple providers. And so it's highly likely that at least some of your apps will need to access other apps, whether it's in the same container or cross-container or cross-VPC or even cross-cloud. So where am I going with this? Well, with legacy PAM vaults designed for the data center, they were designed to function in a single network behind a single firewall. They were designed for single tenancy. And so you're likely to end up with having to replicate vaults. And then you'll need to figure out how to sync them up, poking holes in your firewalls and probably paying a lot of money for additional infrastructure and product licenses and operational staff. And so managing them will be problematic as well. And you'll probably need to build in some kind of VPN-based remote access to each of those independent VPCs in order to gain access and manage your vault instances. And so whether it's remote IT or whether it's outsourced IT and third parties, they're all going to face these similar challenges, and your business is going to be impacted by that. Now, if you contrast that with a PAM vault designed more for the kind of modern use cases that we've already discussed, then if you recall the picture that I put up from the prior myth, here we introduce this multi-tenant vault designed for the cloud, accessible from anywhere. There's no need for physical replication into each VPC and cloud provider, and so the users, whether remote IT or internal IT or outsourced IT, they can all simply log into it from their browser. Now, as I mentioned previously, this lightweight server gateway that you see in the diagram here that represents the vault in each of those endpoints, that provides that SAS vault with whatever services it needs. So it could be AD, RDP, SSH, etc., without having to replicate the vault. But there are other benefits that an architecture like this provides that the legacy vaults won't, and that's what will additionally make it hard for them to adapt to the more modern use cases. Now, one of them is secure VPN-less remote access, and another one is a clean source. Now, remote VPN access, especially for third parties and outsourced contractors, that has its security issues because using a VPN, it kind of physically attaches them to the network and it exposes more of that network. And so you run the risk of them gaining access to your internal infrastructure, not just the systems that maybe they're allowed or should be allowed or designed to access for their job function. So we have little control. In addition to that, we have little control over those end systems, the workstations or the laptops that those external users are using to gain access to our system. So we don't know if they're surfing the web with them, which they probably will be doing. We don't know if they've got viruses or malware on them. So if you're using a traditional VPN, there's the risk that could infect your internal systems. And obviously, that's not a brilliant idea. So this gateway-based model solves both of these problems. Number one is, fundamentally, it's isolating our internal systems from the workstations and laptops and computers that your remote or outsourced IT partners are using. And so you're avoiding the risk of infections being spread. VPNs are no longer required for those remote sessions. So that server gateway you see in the diagram there, that establishes the downstream session to the servers that they need to manage, an SSH or an RDP session, for example. But it then tunnels that back through a web browser session. And so since the user's computers are no longer network attached through a VPN, there's no risk of viruses or malware spreading. Now, another benefit of this is for IT, because IT can avoid the overhead of having to clean up infections, taking systems offline and making them unavailable, of managing VPN clients and passwords for VPN login, maybe struggling to enforce antivirus and anti-malware and patch updates on those end systems, which is always an uphill battle, or using third-party tools like Cisco NAC, which can be a complexity in itself. So this kind of avoids a lot of those complexities. It increases security and it reduces overheads for IT. Now, having the Vault here as a SaaS service, it also simplifies life for developers who need to programmatically check out passwords, or as we said earlier, ideally obtain short-lived tokens from the Vault service. It becomes more of a trivial exercise with the Vault as a service because they can use CLIs or API calls and they can avoid firewall-related issues. Okay, so for this myth number 3, legacy PAM vaults arguably are not going to be the best choice for these types of hybrid cloud environments and some of the nuances that didn't really manifest themselves back in the legacy days of on-premises. All right, so it looks like we have another poll question, so hopefully you'll see that on your screen any second. So this one is about legacy PAM. So if you have existing PAM, have you attempted to use it to support any of your cloud-based projects? And if so, how is it working out for you? So again, we'll give this 10 seconds, not 10 minutes, to get some results coming in before we move on to the final myth. All right, let's see if we got some results here, and we do. So let's see. So the most comes from the top one. We are yet to embark on our first cloud migration project. Very interesting. Certainly, I talked to a lot of customers and prospects, and certainly the larger enterprises, if they're not cloud first, they've certainly dabbled in the cloud fairly significantly. So it'd be interesting. Maybe we have some mid-market or smaller people representing smaller companies on the webinar today. So interesting stuff. Thank you for that. Let's move to myth number 4. So many companies that we've spoken to, they voiced concern over the potential cost of PAM. So as they move to the cloud, they migrate projects. What's this? Do we need new PAM? How much is it going to cost, kind of thing? I don't have empirical numbers here, but they believe that a complete rip and replace is required, or maybe that they will need 2 separate PAM stacks, one to accommodate the existing infrastructure on premises, and the other one for the cloud. It's going to end up costing a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort. So what's the reality? Let's see if we can somewhat debunk that myth. So without question, a legacy PAM designed for on-premises is going to find it really hard, if not impossible, to support hybrid cloud workloads. We kind of just beat that one to death. It's kind of a round peg in a square hole. If you do try to extend it to support the cloud, then 3 things that we should note. Point number 1, again, casting your mind back to the previous myth, there will inevitably be issues of time, cost, and effort to deploy additional PAM infrastructure to each VPC in each cloud, along with all of that sort of ongoing maintenance and software updates and operational costs, et cetera, et cetera. Excuse me. So moving on, point number 2, if you contrast that with a modern PAM approach, yeah, there will be costs, but you can exclude or you can significantly reduce some big ticket items. If you try to use a legacy PAM stack, then you're responsible for a lot of heavy lifting, designing, deploying, configuring, ongoing support and operations, all of this yourself. But with a SaaS vault, you can delegate 90% of that heavy lifting to the SaaS provider. Now, this kind of modern vault architecture, again, designed for the cloud, it can also leverage the cloud economy in a way that legacy vaults can't. So what I mean by that is something designed for the cloud as cloud native will naturally take advantage of other cloud native services. So built into it, it will leverage things like elastic scaling and load balancing and fast storage and messaging. So those you will find being taken advantage of. And if you try and use a legacy system up in the cloud, they pretty much hooked into whatever services were installed and available on premises at that time. Now, in addition, it won't take months to get a basic vault operational. So, for example, we have a free tier offering up in AWS where you can sign up, give a credit card, you won't get billed until you hit a certain threshold, but you can be up and running in less than an hour. So it's fully redundant, it's fully load balanced. Obviously, it's being managed and operated by Centrify. In fact, some of our customers have deployed one of these in parallel, kind of as a toe in the water, and they've slowly transitioned over away from their legacy over time to avoid any potential disruption. So your time to operation can be dramatically shorter. So the modern SaaS approach clearly has a lower bar. So point number 3, excuse me, you can most definitely continue to leverage your PAM-related investments. So when you stand up a new virtual machine, a set of virtual machines and containers in the cloud, both sides of the PAM coin, the vault and that privilege elevation on the host, they will combine to help you quickly and easily reuse those existing technologies that you have for use across the hybrid environment. So, for example, brokered authentication. This is something that enables an administrator to use their existing AD, their existing LDAP credentials to log into these cloud-hosted systems just as you do on premises without having to replicate your AD infrastructure into the cloud. Now, this is one of those nuances of a hybrid model that legacy PAM can't really accommodate. It assumes everything is, again, fully addressable on-premises in the same network, but in the cloud, your new systems can't see your on-premises AD. And so to authenticate to them using AD credentials would require perhaps site-to-site VPNs, which can be very costly. It could require replicating domain controllers in your cloud and having to manage complex trust models, deploying read-only domain controllers, et cetera, et cetera. So not only is that time-consuming and costly, but it's an inhibitor when, for example, you want to expand, let's say, to a new VPC or a new cloud, or if there's an M&A, and you want to very, very quickly bring something new into the fold. So if you're using a third-party MFA solution, let's say you're using RSA Secure ID or a YubiKey or a Duo or a smart card or even mobile authenticators, you can continue to use them. You can enroll them in the vault, and you can even extend their scope. So what I mean by that is that legacy PAM solutions, they will typically only allow you to leverage MFA in one place, and that's on login to the vault. Now, that's not the only place where administrators or potentially cyber attackers could and should be challenged to prove their identity. So you can leverage your existing investment in MFA to reduce risk even further. Sure, you can do it at login to the vault, but with a SaaS solution such as the Centrify solution, you can now optionally challenge at password checkout from the vault. Or perhaps when you're establishing a remote login session from the vault, you might challenge at that point. And even on the server itself, irrespective of the vault, you could use MFA to prompt for a second factor at login to the server itself. So again, if an attacker is bypassing the vault and going straight to the server laterally, you could stop them at that point. And also on privilege elevation, you could selectively prompt for a second factor when elevating privilege. So we're not only leveraging that existing MFA investment, we can also extend its value to further help you reduce your risks. All right, so now we're kind of in the last stretch. Let's tackle this last myth. So PAM is often pigeonholed into a very specific job, vaulting shared privileged accounts, period. But can a modern PAM solution help in other areas of security, such as ransomware? So let's take a little bit of a peek into that. So in July earlier this year, my colleague Torsten presented a webinar that was titled 5 Steps to Minimize Your Exposure to Ransomware Attacks. Had a great turnout. It's a fantastic resource. If you haven't seen it, I highly encourage you to watch it. Now, the video recording can be found on our website, but Natasha, I think, has already posted the link into the chat window. So that's good. Now, in this, he went into detail on how PAM can play a major role in ransomware prevention. So obviously, I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I'll cherry pick a few elements of that in order to bust our final myth. So we see more and more ransomware. We see a massive uptick in ransomware attacks. So given the likelihood of a ransomware attack, let's consider basic steps that organizations can take to minimize the risk of being victimized. Now, the basic steps to minimize the risk of being victimized, this can be split into 2 categories, and we see them on the screen here: business continuity and prevention. Now, business continuity doesn't explicitly involve PAM, but for completeness, this slide shows 3 essential activities that you should include as part of your kind of overall cyber hygiene, I guess, for want of a different term, as recommended by the U.S. government. It's an outfit of the government called the Interagency Technical Guidance. Now, if we move on to preventive considerations, PAM can play a role in this. Now, both that U.S. government agency as well as the FBI, they recommend these 6 preventive measures when it comes to proper hygiene. And the one that has the most relevance to us in a PAM context is the final one there, least privilege. So if you remember from myth number 1, privilege elevation, that implements a least privilege model of access control. That's the other side of the PAM coin. Now, these recommendations say that we should configure access controls with least privilege in mind. Now, if a user doesn't need to access specific servers or read specific files or run specific commands or applications, then the user should not be granted the rights to do that. So that's the least privilege model, and that reduces the potential impact of both legitimate mistakes as well as constraining what an attacker might be able to do if they compromise that account. So PAM can certainly help with something as potentially disastrous as ransomware or more innocuous compromises such as stealing time and CPU on your cloud instances in order to mine bitcoins, which is something we see more and more of every day. So finally, I just wanted to share an example kill chain that highlights some of the tactics used by cyber attackers and some of the ways that PAM can help break that chain at various stages. Now, there's lots of kill chains. If you do a Google for that, you'll see lots of variants, but they all kind of follow a very similar pattern. Now, I don't have time to dig into this. I'm not going to go through this kind of section by section. In fact, we're going to do a separate webinar or a video specifically on this. But you can download this deck and you can review this slide at your leisure. So what it shows is a typical attacker. Ultimately, on the right-hand side, they've managed to exfiltrate some sensitive data from our systems. And in the red boxes are things that we, Centrify, can do in order to block that, to break that chain at that point and prevent them from ultimately exfiltrating your data. So please take the time to review that. And obviously, if you have any questions, then feel free to reach out to us. So based on this and all the prior myths, hopefully our goal is that you're in a much stronger position to kind of compare and contrast a legacy PAM solution versus a more modern PAM offering, and to determine and kind of figure out for yourself what can better satisfy the needs of your business, especially given that the cloud-hosted workloads and cloud-hosted data now give these attackers yet more attack surfaces for ransomware attacks as well as other types of attacks. So we have a final poll, so let's go on to that. This final question is sort of how many of you were aware of PAM's flexibility in helping address newer attack scenarios such as ransomware, things that are kind of off the beaten PAM track from a contextual perspective, but nonetheless could help. So we'll give you 10 seconds to click a button. All right, let's see if we have anything coming in. I hit the wrong button. Let's see if I can hit the right button. So we got 25% saying I wasn't aware of this, which is cool. I wasn't aware of this. We'll definitely try to leverage PAM, and your existing solutions may help in that regard. 40% I was aware of this, but we're not leveraging it within a PAM context, which is interesting. So, you know, there's probably multiple tools to help you in a ransomware context, but hey, PAM could be one of those diamonds in the rough that you didn't know could help, and maybe it will help you reduce risk even further. So that's pretty cool. All right, so we're done with the myths. Here is a summary slide. Let me build it out. I'm not going to go into each of these. You can reference this slide at your leisure, but it kind of summarizes where we are. So as a reminder, what time is it? We've got like 5 minutes. Please use the chat window if you have any questions, and we will see what we have in the list. Let me pull up a couple that might be of interest. So here's one. So this is Sunil. Hello, Sunil. Thank you for your question. So it says, in your example, you talked about password checkout using a vault, but vaults can also do access control. So it's an interesting question. I think it's referring to what I was saying about vaults pretty much being focused on more of a login type of scenario, whereas privilege elevation also does authorization as kind of solving more of that problem. But also, I think you may be referring to command filtering at the vault level. So that's quite a bit different to the explicit access control that's done on the host during privilege elevation. So, I don't think anyone would argue that if you have the ability of intercepting commands and activities at the operating system level, that's going to give you a lot more visibility and granularity than if you tried to do that, let's say, at the Vault proxy level, and you're trying to interpret commands there. So, for example, on Linux, Linux supports aliases and alias expansion. So an alias may have an innocuous name like Tony, but it may expand and translate into multiple commands or application calls. But it's the Linux OS that does that translation and that expansion. So if you have privilege elevation on the Linux box, then we can leave the operating system to interpret what Tony means as an alias and expand it. And then your privilege elevation software can then react to those underlying commands that might ordinarily be kind of bypassed or invisible. And so you can then apply policy to it. You can't easily do that at the proxy, at the Vault, not unless you kind of emulate the bash shell or the C shell or whatever it is down in the Linux OS that's doing that interpretation or translation in the first place. So that's not simple to do. And another example is shell script. So, command filtering will only see the script name that we want to execute. It won't see all of the various commands that may be embedded within it. But if you have that presence on the host at the OS level, then you can act on those individual commands executed within the script, and so you're mitigating your risks much more at that point. Now, the other big thing is that we can't guarantee that an attacker will go through the Vault. As we know, and even from that kill chain diagram, they'll try and get a presence on a server in the network, and then they will try and move laterally. So they're not going to go through a Vault just because you happen to have one in place. So command filtering at a Vault and even session recording at a Vault is somewhat irrelevant if they're going straight to the server. So you really need to have that at the server. And I mentioned session recording. Yeah, you need privilege elevation on the host, but you also need session recording on the host, so it can't be bypassed. Let's see. So here's another question. If your cloud-based Vault is used, then how do all my enterprise user accounts get synchronized to your cloud? So interesting question. So back in, I think, the fourth myth, I think it was, when I was talking about rip and replace and the high costs, I mentioned something called brokered authentication, which is a capability that we introduced into our product, specifically designed for this kind of situation. So administrators, all they have to do is log into Windows, Linux, and Unix boxes using their enterprise credentials. And our client on the box itself will talk to the SaaS service and say, hey, I just got this identity and a password. Can you authenticate it? The cloud service will act as this identity or directory broker, and it has visibility through those gateways to your enterprise directory on premises, whether it's AD or LDAP or even a cloud directory. And so it can authenticate against those without the cloud service needing to synchronize those accounts up into the cloud or have visibility to them. So you don't need to replicate that AD infrastructure, that LDAP infrastructure, no need for a new AD forest in AWS or complex AD trusts. So the SaaS Vault acts as that directory broker, okay? So I believe, do we have time here? It's 11:58. Let me go to the Q&A. Does the password vault exist on premises or in the cloud providers such as AWS? That's a question from Rich. Thank you, Rich. So the answer is that we designed our vault as a SaaS service primarily because we believe that's where the vast majority of modern use cases are going to manifest themselves. But then we ported it down to on-premises as well. And arguably, it's much, much easier to take a multi-tenant SaaS service and have it implemented as an on-premises version or deployment option that our customers can manage themselves than it would be to take something that was developed monolithic legacy on-premises and try to retrofit it up to the cloud as a multi-tenant SaaS service. So we specifically took that route. So the net is, what I'm trying to say is, we have a vault service called the Privileged Access Service, and you choose your deployment option. Do you want to manage it yourself in your own infrastructure, in your own private cloud, or in your own data center? Or do you want to consume this as a SaaS service in the cloud that Centrify manages and operates? It's your choice. So I think I'm seeing noon. I think we're done. So with that, we're going to wrap up. Do you want to close it out, Natasha?
Yes, thank you so much, Tony. That was great. I do see there's a few more questions outstanding, so I'll make sure to get answers to those and get you an email with those answers. So again, appreciate your interest. And then again, thank you all for joining today. We really hope that the session was helpful. I think based on the number of questions and the poll answers, it definitely was. A reminder that you will get the presentation and the recording within the next 24 hours. And we hope to see you here again. Thank you all for joining. Bye.
Goodbye.